This topic sounds a little bit dry, but I think it's really something that all anarchists and political theorists in general need to spend a lot of time thinking about, and that is what property is, and what the definition of property is, and how different societies might in fact have different property norms and systems of dealing with property. And for the purpose of this conversation, I'd like to put aside rights, in fact, and talk more about norms. So in a society with one property norm, where, say, a person owns a house, a person who broke into that house would be viewed as a criminal. And so this society operating on this sort of property norms will enforce certain property rights, but the important thing is the norms. And so I'm going to start with talking about Lockean property norms as a system of property norms founded on homesteading. So you homestead land, and this is how it comes into your ownership. And the other system of property norms I'm going to be talking about is also a theory of homesteading. It is occupancy and use property norms. And homesteading is, in fact, really identical between these two systems. I'm talking about verses in the title, so there are some differences, but they're both essentially homesteading theories. So you appropriate nature. That is how land comes into ownership. Now, the difference between Lockean and occupancy and use property norms are abandonment theory. So how does property or land stop being yours? And in Lockean theory, there is abandonment, and some, various people who call themselves Lockeans debate on the specifics, but when a property falls out of disrepair, and essentially is reclaimed by nature, because you gain your property in Lockean theory by claiming it from nature. So if you abandon something, it becomes reclaimed by nature, you abandon it. In occupancy and use property norms, abandonment, there's a much lower threshold for it. So typically, occupancy and use property norms don't grant property ownership to any absentee owners. Someone who's not actively occupying and using the property would not have any sort of property claim. Whereas in Lockean norms, you can have maybe the owner of the boat is not who's operating and using the boat. And the abandonment threshold is not so low, however, to allow many straw man arguments against the occupancy and use property norms, such as that if I leave my car unattended, someone can take it. Or, for instance, lobster fishermen, they might not be occupying their lobster traps they leave in the ocean, but I think occupancy and use norms would still allow for, returning to something, using it maybe without occupying it. So really, I think the main difference here is rentals play a much larger role in Lockean norms, and a society with Lockean norms tolerates a lot of rentals of land even, and rentals of chattel property. And so kind of to describe the difference here between land and chattel property, which is essential to understanding some of the nuances between these theories. Chattel property is anything you can move, and so even houses, I think, are really chattel property. You can pretty much move anything now with current technology, and so land is anything that's inherently immovable. So, you could say a stream could be land, so land doesn't have to be the colloquial usage of land, but it's a part of nature that's inherently immovable, and it could be improved by humans too. For instance, soil is improved over the course of hundreds of years to be better and better by doing things like doing special crop rotations and such. So land can be improved, and neo-Lockean or Lockean occupancy and use norms differ with regards to rentals of land as the primary economic difference. And so the different schools of thought who kind of fall on either side of these. The anarcho-capitalist school in the Rothbard tradition, Rothbard was a big fan of Locke. He didn't like Locke exactly because Locke had something called a proviso, where if all the land has been homesteaded, his theory pretty much goes out the window. He didn't exactly have a backup scenario. He just said, my theory is only valid so long as all the land has been homesteaded, and Rothbard did not buy into this theory. He said Locke was right except for this proviso. And so other theorists who consider themselves Lockeans would be Robert Nozick, is a Lockean, and he bought into the proviso, and his solution to if all the land has been homesteaded was Georgism, which is the philosophy of Henry George, and that is that you get a rebate check pretty much. All the landowners, they have to pay the government whatever their land rental value is, and the government gives everyone a rebate check. So the occupancy and use theorists are more along the lines of left anarchists, and it's in a sense, kind of a way to categorize them that they don't always self-identify as, but I think theorists who are more falling into this category would be more of the Proudhon, Benjamin Tucker, except, occupancy and use, again, can be interpreted two ways. There's the strict property norms, and then there's kind of striving to have a society of more owner occupants and fewer absentee occupants. So there's all sorts of shades of gray on the theorists who fall more along the occupancy and use side rather than the Lockean side. And there's some theorists who think they are indeed the same thing. Chartier has a theory that they are actually, in any society, will work out exactly the same, which I disagree with. So, what I'll spend, how much more time? Yeah, 10 minutes, 15, all right. So I'll go through some criticisms of Georgism, which is one solution to generally called the land problem. And when we're discussing the land problem, we're not talking about chattel property, which is movable property. We're exclusively discussing land. And so I think there's a lot of people who agree on chattel property being, Lockean in the sense of being able to rent out chattel property and this not being any sort of abhorrent thing in property norms being enforced on rentals of chattel property, and land being a different question, and the land problem being particularly problematic. So Henry George suggested giving out these rebates to citizens, and kind of one main problem with this is the psychological problem and an incentive problem, where if you kind of view the country as a joint stock company and every citizen has a share, this is not very conducive towards allowing immigrants, and it's conducive towards xenophobia in the sense that if you allow more people and you're watering down the shares, oh, this is a company, we all own, we the people of this country. If we let a bunch of immigrants in, we're going to have to each give them a share. It's going to water down the citizens' dividend, we'll get less. And kind of the extreme example of this would be Switzerland, which proposed giving all its citizens $35,000 a year just for breathing. And this actually puts you in the top 1% of Earth. If you earn $35,000 a year or more, you're in the top 1% of Earth income-wise. So it's a policy that's creates incentive problems in a democratic society to vote for immigration, and then also it's just kind of mathematically incompatible in some sense. People will have to see, especially in rich countries, it doesn't create the exact same incentive problem in poor countries. So I think that's one way maybe Georgia would work more in poor countries than it would in rich countries. And in fact, Rothbard advocated some mix of Georgism to privatize the USSR. He advocated a mix of homesteading and Georgism. So every citizen would get a stock in the big public utilities. So all the land would be privatized by giving each citizen a stock instead of auctioning it off to whoever had the most money at the moment, which Rothbard realized were the oligarchs, the Soviet commissars were the only ones with any money, and they did end up buying all the land on the open auction. Rothbard's kind of prediction of the permanent entrenched oligarchy in Russia after the land privatizations was true. So, even Rothbard thought Georgism might be a solution to the land problem in some societies, although he kind of advocated for a mix of that and homesteading to privatize all the land in the USSR. And the US, is a very different society from the USSR. One theory of property that I kind of like is the blockchain theory of property, which I'll spend maybe a minute discussing here, where if the property is granted out by the king, to some nobility member, 5,000 square miles of land, which is the norm for property distribution. So the Lockean homesteading theory and the occupancy and use homesteading theory, they break down in societies without homesteading. And pretty much everywhere on the East Coast US, there hasn't been homesteading. That's not how land was located. It was located through large royal land grants. So the blockchain theory of property, I guess, would say the original large royal land grants are not a market phenomena. They're a fiat phenomena, and the rent extracted by the nobility, who are given these rent grants, are not market phenomena. They're a fiat phenomena, and in order to achieve a market society, you need to get as far away from these initial land monopolies as possible. And so one way is if you have the land broken down through the centuries until you have smaller market-friendly units such as the individual homeowner or maybe the small homeowners association. This is the way to get transition from a feudal fiat society to a market society where the state is not determining ownership and determining the sizes of property units. But this is a long-run solution that maybe has worked itself out in New England since we are many hundreds of years removed from the initial royal land grants, but maybe is not an answer to the large privatizations that happened in Russia that maybe were not a good idea. In Latin America, there's a lot of large land privatizations that Rothbard actually kind of agreed more on the occupancy and use side and thought that the land titles were illegitimate because they were not derived at all from homesteading, and there had been none of this, blockchain theory of property at work either, where the land throughout the centuries is slowly given more and more legitimacy each time it's exchanged in the market, and the market resizes it, revalues it, redivides it. If you just have large privatizations given to offshore corporations, which is the norm in a lot of the third world, then Rothbard, fell more on the occupancy and use side than the Lockean side of land being seized by the workers and whatnot. So I think the land question and the distinction between Lockean and occupancy and use property rights is an issue that requires a lot of thought and a lot of economic considerations. And I think one thing to think about is the distinction between economics and morality, which is a distinction that the Austrian School of Economics is very keen on. They call everything vert frei if you take the morality out of it. And I think we need to look at things through two lenses. One is the moral lens, and then the other is the economic lens of how the real world really looks, and the distinction between a feudalist society and a society of landlords, where I think it's hyperbolic to call it feudalism when I think the market very often chooses the form of landlord relationships, and there's a big benefit if people don't have the cash up front to buy a house and rent it. Airbnb is a hugely influential phenomena, and all rentals of land even are just long-term Airbnbs. So, it's a nuanced issue, but I guess I'll open it up to questions. I don't know how much more time I have.
Yeah, you got 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, we got Jack.
Yeah, if you take the moral view of this and you settle on one of these land theories, if you rule the world, man, the transition has got to be tough. I mean, you've got, people whose land rights come, down from some grant from a king and everything, which in libertarian view would be illegitimate in the first place. So, like now it's been subdivided and sold. And what would happen?
And in New England, they'd be tough. And in some parts of the world, I don't even want to touch the problem. Like Israel and Palestine, I honestly don't go near it. I don't know what the Lockean occupancy and use, like Rothbard had a very anti-Israel view. I don't know if I completely side with evict all the settlements and everything, but yeah, these issues are very tough, and it's very hard to see which is the free market side. Is the person who has the property deed from the state necessarily the free market owner of that property?
Can I chime in on his what keep Joe here decided? And
yeah, definitely. Should I bring the microphone over there? Do we want to get the questions on the microphone?
if you own some property now in New Hampshire, and it's like the guy you bought it from, or yeah, whoever, and the person that bought it from, it goes like 7, 8, 9 steps removed back to like King James or whoever from the early 17th centuries, and then kind of moved because you have a house you may or may not have built, or you might have bought a house from the person before you, but you maintain that. You might have built an addition, built a garage, carport. What? Yeah, I mean, you de facto homesteaded it. So isn't it really moot, like the chain of ownership, that it was originally just some big wig signing something that they didn't even have an accurate map of the land. And they just said between these two latitudes all the way to wherever. They didn't even know what it looked like.
Yeah.
That's all kind of moot. And then I have no.
Yeah, well, if no one else doesn't want to give it back to you for another question. I think one criticism of, whoever's on it now has homesteaded and has the right is, so for instance, the state sometimes will give hundreds of square miles of land rights out to big logging companies, and you can argue that maybe these logging companies have homesteaded it.
The forest roads that they built for no other reason.
Yeah. So you can make a lot of these arguments. It kind of all depends on the notion of homesteading, but it's important to remember the state is using a vast, enormous apparatus of compulsion and coercion to enforce these property rights. So Ted Turner, owns millions of miles that is backed up by, the police and the military. And so maybe he goes out and homesteads it somehow by establishing nature conservancy signs or something. This isn't just kind of done in a vacuum of him going out and homesteading and everyone going, okay, look, he's homesteading, he owns the property. This is, these millions of square miles are being kept off the market and kept from other homesteaders by a monopoly claim backed by an enormous socialist institution. So I kind of like the metaphor when Kevin Carson has the iron hand, or with the iron fist behind the invisible hand of property is, when it comes into being, if it's the result of a socialist, monopoly military thing, isn't exactly Hayekian spontaneous evolution.
So I just want to say something on rent, I guess. And sorry to form into a question, but I think that the problem that mutualists usually have with rent isn't so much, it differs. So for example, the neo-Peronians like Sean Wilbur, Derek Woodroff, people like that, more likely to call it anarcho-capitalists like neo-feudalists and stuff like that, and like these really uncharitable claims that I don't agree with, and like I think they're too strong, too uncharitable personally. And I've never seen how neo-Lockeanism will somehow de facto lead to that. I mean, I side with the use in occupancy, but I'm kind of like Kevin Carson on this. He used to be a lot stricter on this position, and he's not so much anymore. He's more interested in sort of like different systems of property competing with each other. He still thinks use in occupancy is the best, but he thinks that there might still be something to be said for renting in some limited context within an economy, and I think that's true. I think the concern is largely just out of sort of the spirit of reciprocity, people being concerned that landlords will have too much power over tenants. I think, though, I kind of agree with Benjamin Tucker that the classes will kind of become, they won't disappear. Like, I'm not a Marxist, I don't think that we'll have a class in society. I think they'll be blurry, though. I think the lines will get a lot less clear and distinct about who exactly is the tenant and who exactly is the landlord. I think you see this today when friends, rent from each other. There's more of an informal exchange, the power, if you miss a month's rent, it's not the end of the world. You've got a friend, and you can say, hey, I'll pay you back when I, do whatever. So I don't know, and I think things like Airbnb sort of like help sort of a more market-based solution. I mean, we don't live in a free market, but at least it's more of a market-based solution for undermining the land monopoly. So, and that was not formally a question, but sorry.
I guess I'll briefly comment. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing of the difference between, kind of like a feudal society and a market society has to do a lot with cartels. And, do you have all the cartels? So like a feudal landlord for a European country, and there's even kind of outright feudalism in the US with New Zealand, not New Zealand, New Brunswick in Canada had real feudalism going for a while. And it's like, you think of feudalism as a cartel system like the taxi medallions or other medallions, where the feudal lords have a real control over the market, and they have all these medallions, pretty much every industry. You know, and when you have very small property units, pretty much it's impossible to cartelize, you know, an entire industry. It's really, you know, you can just outcompete. There's no one who gets to kind of collect taxes. You know, people might decide to live in co-ops, they might decide to rent apartments, but these relationships are fundamentally different than enormous territories governed by feudal lords, where monarchies can really cartelize and have almost land medallions. And kind of the reason why feudalism is maintained is through things called entail, and you can't mortgage the land, you can't give the land to anyone but your daughter or son. And so the market kind of naturally breaks up large land holdings, as it did in America from the original land grants, because it didn't have entail. But entail in Europe kept feudalism going for almost 1,000 years by preventing people from mortgaging their land or subdividing their land or selling it. So I think the market on its own is a powerful force against feudalism, even if the initial land grants, like in New England, were fairly closely resembling feudalism, right? A few people got, you know, millions of miles of land. If you don't have things like entail, I think the market on its own over time will break up the feudal society into a more market society. So, all right,
Really,
ask another question.
What I was really going to say also happens to touch on what Nick introduced. So I think there's a common critique, maybe not so much with mutualists, but more with anarcho-communists and anarcho-syndicalists saying we are like statists, we ANCAPs and volunteers are really static. For the people in the room who are that, I assume many of us are. So they say that, well, would Ancapistan be nothing more than a patchwork of microstates? If you as a landowner have the right to do anything on your land without violating the NAP, or they'll even say, well, you have the theoretical right to do anything. Well, I would say that the NAP is what rescues that, because okay, so in a strict authoritarian state like Saudi Arabia, you know, that you can, you know, it's, you know, the king can probably has harems and whatnot, and, you know, has a right to kill, like, anybody, you know, he's an absolute monarch. They literally own you, and to the greater or lesser degrees in all various states. Now, if I, in Ancapistan, if I have a dinner party on my land, and the moment I have all of you come over for my dinner party, and I'm some piece of shit, and I say, so the moment you step on my property, I would not have the recognized right anywhere in Ancapistan to enslave all of you the moment you step on my property. There would be, your security agencies would you know, have, you know, armed, you know, action against me. You know what I mean? So I would not have the absolute right to do anything. It would be limited by you know, the NAP and, you know, the norms of that territory. So I think that's a key difference between an actual sovereign state. So Ancapistan would not be a patchwork of microstates. You know, just owning land in Ancapistan would not be like your own little country, and you would have absolute right to, you know, address.
I'll talk about the kind of, I guess, a brief, getting back to the Lockean versus occupancy and use, and then kind of, I guess, incorporating this whole Ancapistan thing. Well, I think you can have, for instance, different patchworks of areas without the same system of property norms that exist in the same real market. You know, they're not like North Korea, South Korea. They're all immersed in the same market, but different dominions. And so maybe one example would be the left side of the road versus right side of the road. One part of the country will be all right side of the road, one part will be left side. But you won't just suddenly be going back and forth in every random neighborhood because of transaction costs, and it's going to make sense to kind of make one area adhere to one standard, maybe another area adhere to both. And it can be advantageous to have different standards because of comparative advantage. But you know, you can have patchworks, and can be done with not just the trivial thing like right hand, left side, but all the property norms differences. You could have different areas with different property norms. And then all the moral issues we always are debating about abortion, circumcision, and all that. I think you're never going to have a worldwide consensus on these things. You're going to have a patchwork of enforcement agencies that doesn't, I'm not talking about states here necessarily, but maybe the agency in Texas will prosecute doctors, the agency in Massachusetts won't, and in the middle there'll be different shades of neutral, some doing more and more business. And pretty much the reason I think this would shake out without the state centrally planning the justice system is because like killing people is expensive and civil war is expensive, so people will kind of, you know, they will live in areas where they're not going to be in constant conflict with each other over occupancy and use versus Lockean. You know, maybe Barcelona is going to be occupancy and use, and Madrid will be Lockean, and you're not going to go to Madrid and start shit just because it's kind of accepted.
So, I mean, do you agree that, I assume you agree, but I assume talking to on other occasions you're more in ANCAPs. Do you agree that that's a bogus thing that the left anarchists say that ANCAPs and volunteers really are status because if you're in ANCAP ideology, if you're the landowner, you are a micro-sovereign? Like, do you agree with me that, like, is that a good reason that...
Well, if you think you just throw the argument back in, like, the anarcho-syndicalist face and say, well, how is, the union, the syndicate, not the state? I think we're just kind of being bitchy at each other. I think both sides are anarchists and want these units done at micro levels that don't resemble current states. So I think both sides are kind of straw manning. When we say, you guys want Stalinism, and they say, well, you guys want feudalism, it's like, I don't think either of us want either of those. So. Yeah, are we out of time? More questions? Yeah. 5 minutes. Does anyone have anything else?
We want to get a fight in the cynical list.
Yeah, let's have it. I know about 420 celebration is going on across the square if anyone's interested in that. I think Rich Paul is there.
Rich Paul is there? Wow.
Wait for his money time for
Hey, Colin, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question going back to the thing about the original land grants here in the northeast parts of America. And like I said, was anytime anybody has a property, they don't actually use all of it. Nobody uses every quarter of their property. They kind of just use the center. And so, but we all claim that that is the property that we have. And so, yeah, now there's two ways to look at it. He claimed this area. Now, even though he is an estate, or, related to all that, he still, anybody could have done it, right? Anybody could have said this land's mine, right? And obviously, I'm forgetting, natives for one minute. But this one case in which you just claim an area like that.
Well, often there are already people living there is another big problem with the
then I was going to cover that. Because I guess what I want to say is anybody really, in that case, you might have restitution for the people who have been removed from that. But other than that, is there really any issue with it? Like, how's it any different than if I just claimed that I owned?
Well, yeah, again, I guess I was kind of addressing this earlier, is that this isn't in a vacuum. So if you go out and the king gives you 500,000 acres and you go out and somehow homestead it, you're not doing this in a vacuum, you're doing this in the context that the king has said, anyone else who homesteads this is disobeying the king and will be killed. So even if you did homestead it, you're kind of doing it in the context of you got a monopoly. It's like the radio stations, like an example.
But even in real world examples, even though they would say this is this land grant, there would still be people doing that, and then they would just resolve those disputes. Sometimes get them off, sometimes let them live there.
That's true, but what about the chilling effect of the land grant? Maybe people would have homesteaded it, but didn't because of the land grant and the king's forces.
I think in the real world, there are maintenance costs and security costs, and if you weren't able to push those off of the state, people would not be able to maintain such large pieces of property because they're not paying for it. If you had to have a security force to keep people from building houses on your million acres, you wouldn't be able to afford a million acres and stop making you any money. I think a lot of this happens because of our financial system and government regulation. You get rid of that, and a lot of these problems we argue about wouldn't even be an issue. We're going to go away.
Yeah, I mean, Ted Turner has millions of miles. Ted Turner has millions of miles of land, and so maybe he could hang on to this land without the state, but it would cost him a lot of money, is the least thing we could say. So yeah, the state subsidizes large absentee property holdings, and it's something that, I don't think we really know it's kind of like how many frozen yogurt shops will there be in North Korea if the state goes away. I don't think we know how big the property units would be without the state, but I think we do know that there's a huge distortion and subsidy to large property owners to not have to pay the cost of their security. It's one way.